Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching History Summarize: The World Between the Wars by Overly Sarcastic Productions. Now we recently watched OSP's video on the world before the war, where we covered how things were going before the First World War and what were some of the changes and trends that led up towards that conflict. Today we'll get to talk about the aftermath of that war and then how we get from the First World War to the Second. So some really fascinating stuff. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you'd leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Alright gang, the year is 1918 and the First World War is officially over. And not a moment too soon. Wait a minute, first? Oh, fuck! It's fine, everything's fine, the war's done, and Europe is at peace. Now, what's the damage? At a glance, several million dead, 2 empires destroyed with one actively mid-revolution and a 4th about to drop, and all the lasting ingredients for something far worse to happen next.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, how do we end the First World War, and then only about 20 years later, end up with the Second World War? Right? After the First World War, a lot of people thought, they called it the Great War, this was the war to end all wars. Nothing like this would ever happen again. I mean, when you rewind about 100 years, go back to the Napoleonic Wars, that was sort of a similar feeling. After those series of conflicts with millions of people dead, a lot of the political leaders and the civilians of the time thought, you know what, we can't do this again. And so they had the Congress of Vienna, and they had, the Concert of Europe system, and it was, I would say largely effective. It did not entirely prevent war between the major powers, and of course this all ends with the First World War, but I think you can make a good case that that Concert of Europe system, for at least a couple decades to follow, made sure that countries would at least try to negotiate their issues before they went to full-on large-scale war, right? So heading out of the First World War, there was sort of a similar feeling. Okay, we've got to prevent this from happening, and that's what we're going to do. Now, of course, in this case, it did not work. And so in this video, I'm sure we'll cover why that didn't work and why we ended up with another world war that was, of course, even more destructive than the first.
Because the Second World War, I know, I was surprised too, is a direct consequence of trends and outcomes set in motion by the first. France and Britain's favorite boys, Charles de Gaulle and Winston Churchill, were the first to describe the world wars as 2 parts of a new 30 Years' War. And in that framework, the period from 1918 to 1939 is as essential a chapter in the broader conflict as armies on the march across 3 continents.
Yeah, there's one perspective on these 2 world wars that they were essentially one continuous conflict, with perhaps a bit of a break in the middle, but you were essentially talking about one conflict that had these 2 different parts to it. And while I think that might be overstating the case a little bit, what is true is that these 2 conflicts are intrinsically tied together, like OSP just said, like Blue just said. The ending of the First World War really locks in many of the trends and causes that will then lead to the Second World War.
Now, while this thesis is appealingly comprehensive, it doesn't account for a few, pinwheel-shaped wrenches in the gears, and we'll wrestle those hydras in due course to fit them into our framework. So, to trace the interwar period and see how this second act follows smoothly from the first and pointed Europe and the world towards a dramatic Act 3, let's do some history. Now, if the First World War began as just a very big European war with help from all their overseas empires, the next 2 decades would become a truly worldwide affair, because we're contending with newly entangled powers like the United States, the ascendant Japanese Empire, and a recently republicified China.
Yeah, I mean, look, when you talk about the world wars, there's always the question of how global truly were these conflicts, and in fact, some people point towards previous wars, like the 7 Years' War or the Napoleonic Wars, as the true first of the world wars, right? So all these things are sort of on a spectrum, and those wars that I just mentioned were truly global in scale. We decided that what we know as the Great War, or the First World War, would be the first of our series of world wars. Both were truly global, but it is true that the second was definitely more global and more expansive in scope than the first.
Of course, not to be outdone, Europe was being its messy old self, as the quadruple collapse of empires added several nations to our continental cast of characters. Poland reemerged as a nation after a century and a half in partition jail, Serbia got its big Balkan wish for a kingdom of Yugoslavia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire paid dearly for both of them, shedding territories and splitting back into Austria and Hungary via imperial mitosis.
Yeah, so we get a brand new map of Europe with a bunch of new states filling out the continent and beyond. If we talk about the Ottoman Empire, we have a newly independent Poland. This is Poland sort of peeking its head out from the rubble, getting to reestablish itself as an independent state for the interwar period before it is then conquered again. Sorry, Poland. Remember, Poland had not been an independent state since the partitions of the late 18th century. Right, so Poland's really having a bad time, but in this moment, the positive or the optimistic perspective is that you have these great empires collapsing, these new nations emerging, and all the peoples of the world are getting national self-determination. That's the sort of Wilsonian take on it, right? That was very much the ideology of Wilson and a lot of the sort of liberals and progressives of this era. Now, of course, you don't even need to look in retrospect to see that this was not as nice as it seemed. You could even look around at the time, and there were many examples of peoples around the world who were in fact not getting their national self-determination, and who were feeling pretty slighted at this moment. A lot of the colonized peoples of the world who were saying, hey, wait a minute, does this whole self-determination thing apply to us? And the powers of the West were saying, no, it does not. So, there were some positive changes happening here, but as we know, in the long term, well, none of this is really going to work out, right? All it leads to is the Second World War.
Add up all these states on top of our original band of troublemakers with their own objectives, hardships, and shattered senses of self in the wake of the First World War, and it's clear the 1920s and 30s were a dense and, dare I say, messy stretch of years. Reckoning so many competing angles and wrestling them into a single narrative are each an utterly insane task. But if the world wants to be crazy, then damn it, so will I. As the best way to understand any of it is to...
there's a lot of information to cover within the span of a 16-minute YouTube video.
Assemble all of it. Just as the interwar decades make the most sense in the context of what comes before and after, they likewise become clearest when we see the entire stage at once, as movements in one corner have cascading effects for the rest of the lot. So, curtains rise, let's meet our ill-fated cast. Starting in the absolute pits, we have our four busted empires: Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottomans. By far the most reshuffled state in the pack was Russia, having excused itself from the war a year early to do a communist revolution, murder the Tsar's entire family, wage a 5-year civil war against the anti-communist white movement, and form the Soviet Union in 1922. Bad news for all the Tsaraboos out there, but the victorious communists were in turn the most gleefully satisfied with their post-war position. All it took was some light regicide, few million deaths to round it out, smack around the nations who wanted out from under the Russian Empire to keep them in line, and presto, the proletariat is liberated at last.
Yeah, the USSR, at the end of the First World War, was looking pretty bad compared to even some of the other powers. They had left the war early, had been forced to, they made the decision, but they signed over a bunch of territory to the Germans, because they wanted to leave the war early. The country had then gone through years of civil war, brutal millions of deaths, so really in a bad spot. But once it enters its recovery, it is more on the up and up than some of the other powers of this time period, especially when we head into 1929 and the 30s with the Great Depression, the Soviets being a little more isolated from the global economy than a lot of these Western powers, are able to actually continue their recovery at a time when a lot of countries were sort of on the down. But, this is a country that's gone through a lot, that still has a lot of recovery to do in the immediate aftermath of the war.
Well, regime change has a funny way of playing out, as the revolutionaries mounted the Red Terror to impose uncontested one-party rule, a dynamic further exploited by one Joseph Stalin, whose political maneuvering and subsequent purges accrued vast state power into one-man rule. Stalin's reign was uncompromising as he consigned his subjects to die by the millions through political persecutions and willfully exacerbating famines for his policy objectives. No factions, no dissent, no mercy.
Yep.
The czars could only dream of wielding power so complete. Meanwhile, our other three empires were living the waking nightmare of actively disintegrating. We saw how Austria-Hungary broke up into itty little bits, and Germany was forced to shed territory to France and Poland as terms.
Yeah, I mean, each of these empires shattered in a different way. The German Empire basically lost territory along the edges, but maintained most of its territory and maintained a good chunk of its identity as Germany. Now, it lost the sort of identity of Imperial Germany, right? But it was probably the most whole of those three different empires, even though Germany was done very badly by the war in Versailles. You can see they're the best of the three, though, because Austria-Hungary completely collapses. The entire state breaks apart into a bunch of different new countries. And the Ottomans had been in terminal decline for more than a century at this point, and so their decline is just exacerbated by the war, and they finally truly collapse into the modern nation-state of Turkey, right? So, of these three powers, Germany remains the most similar to how it was pre-war, but even it has gone through a lot of changes.
Of the Treaty of Versailles, but more on that later. Now, all this talk of treaties, or the war to end all wars, obscures the pesky reality that conflict continued well beyond the 1918 armistice, both on and off the battlefield, such as we saw in Russia, as well as with the 1919 to 1922 war launched by Greece against the Ottoman Empire. Because what we call the First World War was, in the Turkish POV, the middle chapter of a three-act conflict in the Balkans that tanked the Ottoman state and saw it replaced with the new Republic of Turkey.
Yep.
But not before carrying out the modern world's first genocides outside of a colonial context, in this case against their minority Armenian and Greek populations. This was a campaign of military violence against their own civilians who needed only be guilty of their ethnicity. That brutality...
And I like that they said first genocide outside of a colonial context, right? Because there already had been genocides committed against people through the process of imperialism, but you see here, within Ottoman territory, they committed genocide against the people of their own state, right?
Demonstrates how wartime thinking was not limited to battlefield combatants, and ultimately would not be limited to wartime either. But unfortunately for the Armenians and Greeks, the rest of the world had other priorities, as France and Britain seized upon the Ottoman collapse to carve up Mesopotamia and the Levant and grow their spheres of influence. Impatiently, French and British diplomats already fantasized about just such an opportunity, conducting a secret treaty in 1916 to delineate who gets what if and when the Ottomans croaked. This Sykes-Picot agreement saw some alterations in the jump from schemes to political reality, but France and Britain got what they wanted. More. Because while these two great powers had the rare fortune to remain largely intact through the war, asterisk on the Irish Free State breaking away and the overseas dominions having words about their time in Gallipoli, this meant they retained that 1800s imperialism grindset, the old school drive to do what you can because you can.
This is true. So entering the 20th century, already the time of the 19th century empire is sort of coming to an end. In a lot of ways, these empires are becoming unwieldy, they're becoming quite expensive to run, it's becoming less and less worth it over time. But Britain and France, because they are winners of the First World War, they still get to pretend like everything is fine. They get to continue building their empires, continue their imperial dominance around the world, and as we saw there, a big part of that is now gaining control over territory in the Middle East, sometimes more, sometimes less explicitly. So yes, they are continuing their 1800s imperialism grind set, even though imperialism in that 19th century type of way is becoming less and less viable. Now don't worry, imperialism, empire will always continue, even to this day, but it sort of needs to undergo a bit of a metamorphosis as we head further into the 20th century, and Britain and France are really not ready for that.
Unequal treaties, partitions, the works. Only this time they had the devious thrill of imposing that will on their fellow great powers. And that precise logic guided their approach to the Paris Peace Settlement of 1919. They were victorious, vindictive, and deeply in debt to the third major player of these negotiations, the United States.
Yeah, and when we talk about, why did things go differently here than they did after the Napoleonic Wars, a big part of it is that when you look at the Congress of Vienna back in 1815, not to say France wasn't punished, it was, but the powers of the time realized that, if they wanted to essentially set up a relatively stable balance of power, then France needed to be included as one of the great powers. And so despite the fact that Napoleon had marched around Europe, fighting a bunch of wars, which were not all entirely his fault, to be clear, but despite that, France was brought back in as a major great power and was allowed to participate in the negotiations. You can in part thank Talleyrand for that. Whatever you feel about the guy, he was definitely good at doing whatever he wanted to do. If we look at the Versailles, the Paris Peace Agreement and Versailles, Germany is very much not brought into considerations in the same way. Germany is, first of all, blamed for the war entirely, with that war guilt clause. A massive, massive indemnity is slapped upon them, and they are essentially treated as a conquered, vanquished power. And they did lose the war, to be clear, but Germany is not treated with much grace by her enemies during the First World War, and this leads to a lot of anger and frustration, resentment, and a feeling of vengeance amongst Germans, which, among other things, will directly lead to the Second World War, right? So you see definitely a difference there between the Congress of Vienna and how post-Napoleonic France is treated, and Versailles and how Germany is treated.
The Americans had a different set of priorities for the peace plan, notably focused on creating new democracies with the right to self-determination.
Yes, and when I talk about the sort of Wilsonian perspective or ideology, we're talking about particularly Wilson's 14 points, not all of which were actually implemented, but this was his agenda coming into the negotiations. This is what Wilson wanted to achieve. A big part of that today is national self-determination, which I was talking about earlier, which was not applied equally around the world, but I already made that point.
Nation, but that didn't stop a vicious slate of punitive terms from being levied on the defeated Germany, including disarmament, steep reparations, and being forced to admit guilt for starting the war.
Yeah.
These maximalist demands met with shock and outrage in Germany because the Kaiser's government, which bore the blame, was already ousted, as Germans had proclaimed a democracy at the end of 1918. They did exactly what the Allies wanted, precisely what America was advocating for, yet were still being punished for it. The Paris settlement made clear that the boneheadedness which caused the war had not abated one bit. But who was this mysterious...
Yeah, I mean, Germany gets blamed for the war. The German people are pretty angry. And those who are actually responsible for the war make sure the blame is not on them, right? I mean, the Kaiser has abdicated. By the end of the war, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the two top military men of Germany, were honestly kind of running the German state like a military dictatorship. Those two, by the end, were most responsible for how the war was ended, and they managed to very skillfully pass off responsibility onto the new Weimar Republic, right? And this, in some ways, is the beginning of the stabbed-in-the-back myth, with which both Hindenburg and Ludendorff played into during the interwar period, where these military men would basically start to hint that, and sometimes explicitly say, that we could have won the war, okay? We weren't actually losing, we could have won it, but we were stabbed in the back by these civilian politicians, these socialist politicians, these social democrats, and the implication often was these Jewish politicians, right? And sometimes that was implied, and sometimes in the case of, Hitler, it was stated, right? And so that is the stabbed in the back myth that Germany could have won the war, but it was betrayed by its own politicians, which were primarily made up of socialists, social democrats, and Jews, right? And of course, all of this is tied up in the rise of far-right politics and the rise of the Nazis.
new America on the block. They'd spent the late 1800s heavily beefing up their industry while flexing their might in the Pacific, but the turn of the century saw them take an outsized role in geopolitics. For their first act on the world stage, they entered the war in 1917 and pushed towards an Allied victory, whereupon President Woodrow Wilson laid out a vision of democratic self-determination and global cooperation. For America's second act on the world stage, they would not participate on the world stage.
Yeah.
Congress did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, so America never joined the League of Nations, which was their own idea.
Yeah, funnily enough, this is Wilson's whole thing, to set up the League of Nations, which is basically a proto-UN to establish national self-determination and global cooperation, and then Congress does not sign the deal. And so, the United States is not part of the League of Nations, right? Which it, through Wilson, was essentially the architect of.
America's third act on the world stage, they would destroy the global economy. Belatedly. See, with so much of Europe devastated by the war, America scooped up industrial demand to become the world's leading manufacturer and, through big loans to European governments, the core of the global financial system. The post-war decade was America's roaring 20s, with all the glitz, glamour, and consumer spending propped up by unsustainable debt you could dream of. Now, some party poopers would argue that the economy was running on unrealistic growth expectations, and any contraction in American corporations and banks would have catastrophic ripple effects to anyone dependent on the American financial system, including but not limited to most of Europe.
Yeah, so the United States, in part because of the First World War, has become this dominant economic power, a dominant manufacturing power, and the war played a big role in that. And the Second World War will sort of have a similar effect, honestly. But America has become this dominant power. Its economy, though, is in a bit of a bubble. It is experiencing extremely rapid growth. It is relying on a lot of credit, and so with credit, and we saw this in 2008, right? With the financial crash, when you've got credit or loans, when sort of one chain ends up breaking, the whole system can fall apart, right? And that's sort of what you get in 1929 as well.
Well, to that no-fun attitude, I say... Yeah, you got it in one. The stock market crash in 1929 ushered in the Great Depression. Industry collapsed, joblessness skyrocketed, money dried up, and America had the bright idea to take this mess and add tariffs. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 put up huge cost barriers to international trade, with the goal of increasing domestic production and preserving American jobs. Now, some commerce killjoys would argue that this leads to inevitable retaliation by every other economy imposing their own tariffs, leaving everything more expensive with no actual benefit to any party. Well, to that, you get the picture. And this had extremely...
The Depression begins, and the U.S. Congress has the great idea to slap on some tariffs, signed into law by Hoover, of course. You can't blame all of this on Hoover, but he really was not doing a great job, because of course those tariffs only made things worse.
Ranging implications, not just across the pond to Europe, but over the Pacific to Japan. Following their forcible reintroduction to the world stage in the mid-1800s and their subsequent Meiji Restoration, Japan had rapidly industrialized its economy and modernized its government. But emulating the great Western powers meant acquiring one more tiny little thing: an empire. With Taiwan in 1895 and Korea in 1905, Japan took prime advantage of a weakening Qing dynasty in China to enlarge its own sphere of influence.
Yeah, in Japan, you see a similar trend that you have in a lot of these countries we've been talking about during this video, mainly Germany, which the video hasn't covered much, but I've talked about a bunch, as you see a rising tide of nationalism, militarism, and far-right politics, right? That is prominent in Japan, in Germany, in Italy, in Portugal, in Spain, and a whole bunch of different countries. I mean, those things are rising even in countries like the United States. Now, in the US, we go in a different direction. We have FDR, and so that sort of stuff is able to be repressed. In some countries, those forces take over, like in those other countries I just mentioned. And so Japan is a country where the militarism in particular was a very big part of this, right? In fact, a lot of the empire building that you'll see, particularly during the interwar period, was very much pushed forward by the military, sometimes without even getting the permission of their civilian government, right? So it's a situation where the tail is sort of wagging the dog, right? The civilian government is supposed to control the military, but Japan was getting to the point where the military was almost controlling the civilian government.
By the 30s, this nationalism spun fully out of the emperor's control as a clique of radical Japanese military officers went rogue and staged a conspiracy to precipitate an invasion of the northern Chinese region of Manchuria. The motives for this wildly insubordinate act were clearly opportunistic and not part of any grand plan by the state, but the timing is awfully suspect as the Smoot-Hawley tariffs hit in 1930 and the invasion sprung in 1931, the very next year. Japan was, as island nations are, extremely trade dependent, and tariffs crushed their markets for military resources as well as civilian production. Manchuria had been an extremely lucrative region for Japanese interests, and bringing that in-house insulated Japan from international dependency.
I mean, Japan is very influenced by trade policy during this time period. For example, you can draw a direct line from the oil embargo put on Japan, particularly by the US, straight to Pearl Harbor, right? That has a massive impact on Japan. They need the oil to keep their military running. So we see perhaps a similar thing here, where these tariffs are really harming the Japanese economy, because as they've just pointed out, Japan is an island, and it lacks a lot of the natural resources it needs, and just a lot of the goods it needs. And so it can either trade for those, but if you've got embargoes and tariffs, then that's not really going to work. And so what else can you do? Well, you can do what another prominent island nation did, Britain, and you can build an empire. And so you can control trade and production within your empire.
But once again, this imperialism spiraled out in calamitous directions later that decade, as Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937, perpetrating mass atrocities against the civilian population to the tune of several million deaths. China was, by this point, tortuously reconstituted as a republic and actively battling a communist insurgency led by Mao Zedong, which—
Well, right, I mean and we recently finished up Epic History series on the rise of China. This is the time where, China is ruled by Chiang Kai-shek. He doesn't rule all of it, but he largely rules a unified China. And Chiang Kai-shek, seeing the Japanese invasion, at first decides, that's not my main problem. My main problem is the communist uprising. And so instead of leaving that aside or even negotiating with the communists, he decides to ignore the Japanese and fight Mao. Of course, a little later on, a sort of second unified front is formed between the communists and the nationalists, and they do work together to a certain extent to fight against the Japanese, but it takes Chiang Kai-shek a while to get there.
Which I'm sure will not be consequential at all. But speaking of unspeakable evil, Italy was also entering worst mode. Despite joining the Allied side and winning the war, they didn't get everything they wanted in the Adriatic, leading to cries of a mutilated victory and proof that there is nothing on this earth more obnoxious than a sore winner, because Italy's next act was to invent fascism.
Right, well, Italy and Japan are sort of similar in that way, and the one thing I didn't mention with Japan when we were just talking about it is that Japan is one of the victorious powers of the First World War, but they don't feel like they've gotten what they wanted either. They wanted far more of Germany's colonial possessions, for example, and though Britain and France are really rewarding themselves, Japan feels it sort of gets shafted even though it's a winning power. Italy's in the same boat. It's a winning power. It feels it gets shafted. It doesn't get what it wanted. Sort of interesting that, of our alliance during the Second World War, you've got Japan, Italy, two winning powers of the First War, and then Germany, who feels they got shafted because they did get shafted. Germany is the biggest loser of the First World War, and they really are done pretty dirty by the Entente powers. So, an interesting situation there. But yes, Italy, it's getting quite radicalized. They're feeling quite angry about how the war ended. Of course, the economic downturn isn't going to help, but even aside from that, you get the rise of fascism under Mussolini, who, of course, eventually Mussolini becomes, just like the sort of second partner to Hitler, right? Hitler's the main guy. Mussolini is always number 2, or even number 3 or 4, perhaps. But Mussolini is the guy who starts all of this. He is the prototype.
1919, Benito Mussolini created what amounted to a thuggish street gang for beating up socialists, which he wielded as a political force, co-opting the ancient Roman fasces as a symbol of strength, unity, and action, hence the name of his movement, Fascismo. Riding into power—
Right, in Rome, the fasces, which you saw there, is a sort of bundle of sticks with the axe. was held as a symbol of legitimate authority and power. And so he, reuses that in the fascism movement.
Communist fears in 1922, Mussolini immediately set about transforming the Italian state, reforming the economy, governing by decree, and by 1926, imposing a fascist monopoly on power. As in Stalin's Russia, Mussolini achieved uncontested one-man rule, styling himself as Il Duce. But autocracy did not fully insulate him from political reality, as the Great Depression walloped Italian industry and agriculture. So Il Duce's swerve was to take everyone's mind off domestic issues with a nice, relaxing war. Italy expanded its ongoing Libyan campaign in 1930 and annexed Ethiopia in 1936, perpetrating mass killings of civilians in both. Mussolini's military machismo sent his popularity soaring, and it seemed to validate his view that the state grew stronger and purer through war, so he launched an invasion of Albania in early 1939. If all went to plan, the Mediterranean would be his, and he'd have his new Roman Empire.
Right, and that's what Mussolini is going for, right? All of these fascist leaders, what they do is they harken back to some time in their own country's past, which often involves a lot of fabrication and a lot of myth-making, right? Even when you're talking about a real time in your country's past, like, of course, the Roman Empire was a real thing, there's not a lot of accurate history being done here. But anyway, Mussolini wants to remake his version of the Roman Empire, the new Roman Empire, to sort of prove the power of Italy and his own fascist movement.
While this met objections from the League of Nations, it pushed Italy into the arms of Germany, who wanted nothing more than for the Italians to be their best worst selves. Building on their beautiful new friendship, Il Duce and the German Führer formalized their alliance in 1936, as Mussolini declared Europe would rotate on the Rome-Berlin axis. 1 month later, Japan joined the axis as part of Germany's anti-Comintern Pact, meant to box in the USSR. So it's here, from a combination of personal ambitions and great power counterbalancing, that Italy, Germany, and Japan became partners in international crime. But what about the last part of that axis, those Germany guys? At a glance, Adolf Hitler came to power on grievance. Some of it was based in facts, such as, wow, the economy sucks, which was true. Some of it appealed to nostalgia for a mythologized Wagnerian vision of the German past, but much drew on...
Once again, you're drawing back to a usually imagined time in your own country's history.
Outlandish conspiracies that Germany was betrayed by rogue factions at the Versailles Treaty,
And that's the stabbed in the back myth I was speaking about earlier.
and they, Jews and communists, caused all of Germany's problems. Wildly incorrect, but
Well, yeah, and like I said, that the blamed was the socialists, the commies, the social democrats, and the Jews. And of course, the belief of these right-wingers is that the Social Democrats and the commies were Jews. So it's really all Jews who are to blame, but sort of, I guess, different types of Jews.
But you see the domino chain. His party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, colloquially shortened to Nazi, was utterly unpopular in the 20s. But at the turn of the decade, the Depression struck, and Hitler rode those grievances into power in 1933. His vision for German rejuvenation was a strong state and a mighty military, Versailles disarmament be damned, which could liberate all ethnic Germans from foreign nations and unify them under one banner. This put Austria, the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, and Western Poland as targets to grab. The big one was Austria, the former seat of the other once great German Empire, which the Nazis annexed in 1938. This Anschluss, or joining, was strictly forbidden by Versailles, so getting away with it heightened the sense of triumph among both camps of Germans. Later that year, Hitler invaded not just the Sudetenland, but all of Czechoslovakia, annexing the German areas and vassalizing the rest.
Yeah, I mean, there's this idea. Well, first of all, of course, there's this idea that we need to unify the Aryan German people, whichever country they be in. So Anschluss, getting all the Germans from Austria into the new Third Reich, the Sudetenland, getting the Germans in Czechoslovakia. But it's pretty obvious that it wasn't going to stop there, right? Both because Hitler was an expansionist warmonger, but also, he had this idea of Lebensraum, aka living space, in which he said that, the Germans, he wanted to bring them under one state, one empire, but they needed more space to expand. They needed to expand and spread the pure Aryan race. And so where would they go? Well, these Germans, these pure Aryan Germans, would take territory that was currently occupied by undesirables, For example, Poland, right? So that's the idea is you're not just taking territory that's got Germans in it. What you want to do, and what Hitler was pretty clear he wanted to do, was take over Eastern Europe, was to take Poland, eliminate, deport the Poles, or just make them into an underclass, and allow Germans to colonize those areas and to find success as this sort of ruling class, this ethnic ruling class of the region.
As with Italy's campaigns, it all appeared to work perfectly, and this time there wouldn't be any pesky saboteurs mucking it up. Hitler's playbook followed similar operating principles to Italian fascismo, but while Il Duce was far more focused on coloring in the Mediterranean and cosplaying
The
ancient
music is kind of going hard right now.
Rome, Germany insisted on ethnic Aryan purity, and that zeal was directed at any perceived aliens, such as the Romani and especially German Jews.
Yeah.
Now, permit me to jump ever so
Like I
slightly.
said, it really always came back to the Jews. You know, I mean, the Nazis hated the Jews most of all, and then probably the communists second, but they also thought that the communists were mostly Jews, right? For example, the Nazis had this term Judeo-Bolshevism, right? So to them, communism, Bolshevism was intrinsically tied up with Judaism, right? So, like I said, it really always seemed to come back to Jews. That was the main scapegoat, really, of any issue that the Nazis could see in Germany.
Ahead to connect the dots between the Armenian genocide, the Russian Civil War and later man-made famines, Japan's invasion of China, Italy's Africa campaigns, and Germany's actions, later known as the Holocaust. This is, in effect, the culmination of genocide as policy. States wielding violence against civilians, be they conquered subjects or one's own citizens, to achieve war aims, policy objectives, or plain old ethnic cleansing. It is, let there be no ambiguity, supremely f***ed. The trap, however, would be failing to recognize why this kept happening, how each unpunished genocide gave cover for the next, and how this demonstrates the constant reflex of all these states to choose obliterative war.
Yeah, it hasn't stopped, by the way. You know, I hate to tell y'all, we had the Second World War, we had the Holocaust, and there was this idea of never again, right? We can never let this happen again. But that clearly has not been followed. There have been several genocides since the Second World War, genocides happening right now. So never again, you know, that makes me feel somewhat cynical, but never again has not been followed. You know, I mean, sometimes I think the idea of never again was meant, you know, yeah, never again like it happened in the 1940s. Well, sure, that hasn't happened again. But if you meant never again to mean no more genocide, then it's not been successful. It has happened again several times. It is happening now.
On paper, the Second World War began in 1939 with the invasion of Poland by Germany and Russia and their immediate genocides of ethnic Poles. Yet, Japan had already been in China for 8 years doing the exact same things, same with Italy.
Yeah, I will say Japan's war crimes are very well known throughout Asia, but in the West, Japan sort of gets a bit of cover because of what Germany did, right? And of course, you don't want to, you know, undermine the extent of Germany's atrocities, but just we in the West should remember that Japan commits horrific atrocities by scale, mostly in China, but also in all the different territories that Japan conquers, you know, Korea and beyond. Just they did a lot of it in China because there's a lot of people there, a lot of land was conquered. But yeah, the atrocities Japan does and its empire in East Asia are truly horrific as well.
In Libya a decade prior. Unlike the First War, there was no cascading diplomatic failure that ensnared the great powers. What marks the start of the Second War is that 2 decades of apathy to warmongering and genocide finally broke, because someone, for once, saw this happening and was willing to bleed and die to stop them. So what have we learned? Frankly, more than the great powers did, that's pretty damn clear. But let's make sense of this big awful mess. The immediate causes of World War II are no mystery. Pervasive economic difficulties, viciously opposed ideologies, fierce international grievances, reimagined forms of imperialism, and craven dictators who thought they could get away with anything. What's less obvious...
Yeah, though, they talk about, you know, communism and fascism hating each other. Honestly, and perhaps it was inevitable that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union would always come to blows. I think it probably was. I mean, it shocked everybody when they made that non-aggression pact because they hated each other. But then, of course, they eventually And that happens because Hitler and Stalin, two ruthless dictators, feel that they have shared common interests in conquering Poland and trying to get rid of the Poles. Eventually, those two powers do come to blows. They enter war against each other because Germany invades the Soviet Union, which, like I said, perhaps was inevitable because of how much the fascists and the communists hated each other. But honestly, the build up to the Second World War, that's relevant less because of fascists and communists fighting each other. I think it's more relevant just that in fascist countries, communists were used as such a villain, right? So in Germany and in Italy and a lot of places, oftentimes your more traditional conservatives, and this is what happened in Germany, they made the call that, well, we'd rather have the fascists. Okay, so maybe we got to team up with the fascists to get rid of the commies. We'll do that, right? And this was not really fighting against the actual existing communists. It was more using the communists as a scapegoat, as this boogeyman, which allowed the fascists to come to power.
But arguably much more vital is the underlying truth that the Great War ended, but war didn't. Fighting continued between nations as well as within them, so the mass violence normalized by World War I found constant expression between 1918 and 1939. Every choice made in the interwar period, however clever or heinous, spills from lessons and consequences set in motion by the First War. Do not compromise, always grasp for more, civilians are bonus points. The nationalistic chauvinism which propelled the First World War survived unimpeded into the Second, and in Russia, Japan, Italy, and Germany hardened into the worldview of perpetual militarism, that victory and security are only achieved through total domination of the state and total destruction of one's adversaries, in every place, at every scale, at any cost. That's how the 1930s ends, with these great powers collectively concluding, First World War? Ha! Those guys were amateurs. Now watch this.
Sheesh. Well, there you go. Always fun talking about the worst atrocities this world has ever seen. How about that? It fits well with the epic history video we recently did on the build-up to the Second World War. I guess we've been doing a lot of sort of World War II interwar period history lately. So there you go. If you guys enjoyed this one, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and I'll give you access to a whole bunch of exclusive content. Thank you all for watching today. I hope you're all having a fantastic day, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.